So hello everyone, and welcome back for the final section of this year's Sub-Sahara Spectrum Management Conference. So we've had 3.5 days so far, and it's hard to believe we're now almost at the end. But we do have one more panel discussion, and then we have our final closing ceremony as well, which is going to be coming up very shortly too. So if I show you the proceedings, or sorry, the schedule, I should say, for this afternoon, we're going to be starting very shortly with, as I said, our final plenary session of the conference. So we're going to be looking at where the priorities should lie for regulators in bringing spectrum to market. So we have a fantastic panel with us to discuss those issues, which I'll be introducing our moderator for, Kirill Minchev. I'll be introducing him very shortly, and he will then in turn introduce our panelists for that session. And then following that at 3:50, and remember all of these times are Central Africa time, so you might have to adjust these times depending on where in the world you are. But at 3:50 Central Africa time, we are going to be starting our closing ceremony. So closing ceremony is being hosted by Broadcast Networks Europe. And we have representatives. We have representatives from both ATU and sorry, not ATU. We have from ITU and from ICTA, who are going to be joining us to give some final comments for the as part of that closing ceremony. And then, as I mentioned beforehand, we want to then give the last words to all of you guys out there. We're finishing off with a Have Your Say session. So that will be your chance to bring your audio and your video feed live, to come up onto the stage and to give maybe your final comments or your final conclusions from the conference, and to give any final messages that you want to. So without further ado then, I would like to now start proceedings for our last panel discussion. So I'd now like to pass, or I'd like to bring up to the stage, Kirill Minchev. Kirill, welcome. So we're looking forward to the panel, and we have some excellent panelists with us today. So I will now pass over to you and allow you to introduce the panel. So over to you.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Dan. It's an absolute pleasure to be here at the Sub-Saharan Spectrum Management Conference. Good afternoon, everyone, and indeed good morning or good evening, depending on where you are. And welcome everyone to this final session of the conference. I can't believe it's been 4 days and this conference is almost over. I thought these were all very interesting sessions we had over the past 4 days. Well done indeed to all speakers, moderators, and of course, well done to the organizers. Just a quick introduction on my side. My name is Kirill Minchev, and I'm a manager at ITA Consulting. We are a specialist telecom and spectrum strategy consultancy based in Cambridge in the UK. I'm pleased to have the opportunity to moderate the last session of this conference. In the session, we're going to talk about where should the priorities lie for regulators in bringing spectrum to market. This is always a very interesting topic, and we can quite often hear quite different points of view. And as such, I hope that this session will be quite interesting and entertaining. I'm thrilled to say that we have an outstanding panel of experts for this session from GSMA, Ofcom, ARTP, and from the Telecommunications Regulatory Board in Cameroon. The key questions we're going to try to answer in this session: what is the status when it comes to awarding 5G and other bands in the region? And indeed, which band should we prioritize? To what extent there is a need to make a new spectrum bands available, or should we now concentrate to make the most efficient use of the available spectrum? Of course, we're also going to try to address the hot topic of the day, COVID-19, and what are the pandemic's implications when it comes to the release of spectrum in the region. Furthermore, we're going to try to attempt to answer the question, how the regulators should make sure that the available spectrum is allocated in a fair and efficient way. The structure of the session will be as follows. We'll start with introductory presentations from each of our panelists, and after that, we'll move to an open discussion and a Q&A section. Meanwhile, our audience have the opportunity to put questions to the panel using the chat function on the right of your screen. I'm sure there will be exciting questions coming from everyone, and our panelists will be happy to discuss these. Please also remember that we have a poll, so it would be great if you can cast your vote. Now, let me quickly introduce our panelists, and after that, I will give the floor to each of them for their introductory presentations. To get started, we have Kamal Tamala from GSMA. Then we have Christina Data from Ofcom, the UK regulator. After that, we'll continue with Mondi Alibodian from ARTP. And finally, we have Abdurrahmane El Hajar from the Telecommunications Regulatory Board in Cameroon. Each of them will have the opportunity to make some introductory remarks, and after that, we'll move to a discussion. So without further ado, to get started, we have Kamal Tamala from GSMA. I would like to invite Kamal to give his presentation. Hello, Kamal, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Kirill, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. And I'd just like to echo Kirill's sentiments in thanking the organizers of this conference. I think it's been a very good job. The platform has been great. The content has been fantastic. The conversations have been very enlightening. And congratulations to you on hosting such a very, very good conference. Like yourself, my name is Kamal Tamawa. I work with the GSMA, specifically with the Africa Policy team, with responsibility for driving policy and regulatory development for the mobile industry in the sub-Saharan Africa region. My presentation today will be touching on a couple of areas that I believe regulators should have a little bit of a focus on so that they can help to drive the improvement in access to mobile broadband in the region. So if we could go to the first slide, please. So it's going to focus quite a bit on the spectrum that's the lifeblood of the industry, basically. So speaking to spectrum that's already currently been allocated and also largely been assigned to service providers in the region. When we talk about the 900, the 1800 megahertz, which are traditionally 2G spectrum bands, and the 2100 megahertz band, which is popularly used for 3G. Then you have the 800 or 850, which either is currently still being used for CDMA or used to be used for CDMA, and also the 2.3, which is a very popular fixed wireless access service band. Now, these bands are usually mostly very well assigned, but there are still areas in the way that these spectrum bands have been assigned where if regulators exploit, it could help to improve the deployment of broadband and also the access to it. So in terms of some of the bands, there still remains some areas of those bands that are not yet assigned. And it's important for regulators to, as quickly as possible, look for mechanisms, put them in place to make sure that the remaining spectrum in these bands are assigned. Then in many instances as well, you find that these spectrum bands are assigned on technology specific basis. So the 900 and 1800, for instance, they're usually strictly used for 2G, for example, and this is usually embedded in the licenses. But these bands are popularly able to be used for 3G and for 4G as well. So it is important for mechanisms to be put in place to be able to convert these licenses to technology neutral so that operators are able to deploy the latest technology that is available to also meet the demands of citizens and consumers. Then you find that there's a level of rigidity as well in the spectrum management framework. So with current innovation, there are many mechanisms technically that can be put in place to make spectrum be used a lot more efficiently if the regulatory framework allows for it. So it's important for the current regulatory frameworks to shift from the rigidity that they currently are in and look towards allowing voluntary spectrum sharing, voluntary spectrum trading, and also allowing concepts like national roaming. This will help in better efficiency in the use of spectrum. And then lastly, one key sticking point as well in terms of assignment of spectrum has always been the pricing. You find that there's very serious issues around the pricing of spectrum and how that impacts eventually on the levels of investment that operators will be able to have. And then eventually this trickles down to the final prices for consumers as well. So it's important that pricing policy is developed or it shifts from a focus on short-term revenue gains in assignment of spectrum to more direction towards encouraging increased broadband penetration. Next slide, please. Secondly, there are spectrum bands that have been allocated to mobile and should be available really for access to service providers to use in delivering broadband. So the 700 megahertz band, for instance, it's one of the bands that was identified for as the digital dividend a couple of WRCs ago. And largely, you'll find that in many countries in the region, the spectrum is still not able to be used for mobile broadband because you find that the digital switchover process has not yet been completed, and so therefore broadcasters have still not yet been moved out of this band, or if they have, the process has not yet been completed to the extent that interference into mobile operators services in this band has been completely eliminated. Similar situation as well with the 2.6. Again, popular band that used to be used for MDDS services back in the day. The level of clearing is not very, very high across the region, and it's something that needs to be looked into as well to make sure that this band is available for use in the for mobile broadband. 3.3 to 3.6, or rather 3.5 really, which is currently used for WiMAX. Again, similar situation with the need to clear incumbents in that service. I don't think I need to go too much into detail into the entirety of this band because there's been very wide debates throughout this conference on this. L-band, again, identified for a mobile couple WRCs ago. This is one of the bands that regulators and policymakers in the region need to continue to participate in conversations to make this band available for mobile broadband, as has been identified. Not to go too much into detail into the outcomes of the last WRC in Egypt in 2019, but the 26 gigahertz band, the 40 gig, and the 66 to 71 gigahertz bands, which have also been identified for mobile, and there's a need to continue to participate in discussions that will help to harmonize these bands and make them available for mobile broadband in the region. Next slide, please. So all in all, even with all of these areas being able to be addressed, there needs to be an underlying foundation for the reassessment of how spectrum management is conducted in the region, and that foundation basically is the need to have a spectrum roadmap. Spectrum roadmap basically helps to sort of increase the pace of mobile technology evolution, or rather, it helps to ensure that there's enough spectrum to meet the surge in demand for mobile broadband services. It helps in the sense that it helps to reduce the cycle time for new technology to the demand that is being demanded, and make spectrum available for that technology to be addressed, and for services that are able to be provided with that technology to be provided as soon as possible. It also helps to allocate spectrum for new uses in advance of the technology becoming available, so that the market is able to prepare for those technologies to become available. So from a government perspective, it also helps to forecast future trends and future needs, and helps government itself to prepare as to how it's going to make spectrum available for industry. Next slide, please. So generally, if you have a spectrum roadmap, there are a couple of common themes that spectrum roadmaps will typically address. The key thing to note is that they will usually look 3 to 5 years into the future, and they will set out to address emerging technologies and opportunities for any sort of amendments or shifts in radio spectrum management, the framework itself, and also any approaches in spectrum management. It will look also to address future technological trends and drivers, and see what kind of impact these drivers will have on spectrum policy and planning. And then it also sets out work projects and programs that will help to address the identified challenges and opportunities. It helps to answer what spectrum will be available. It also gives an indication of when that spectrum is going to be available. It sort of makes broad statements around what kind of licensing regimes will be adopted in making that spectrum available. And it also makes it easier for conversations to be had around harmonizing spectrum. So I'll leave it for now here, and I suppose we'll carry on with the conversation when the panel opens up. Thank you very much, Carol.
Thank you very much, Kemal. That was very interesting from you. I entirely agree with you that the good spectrum roadmap is critical. The development in technologies and the trend of using mobile broadband services realize the necessity of developing a national spectrum roadmap. I entirely agree with you that a good spectrum roadmap needs to look well into the future. You mentioned 3 to 5 years, and I entirely agree with that. That being said, I think a roadmap should be an evolving document that needs to be evaluated on an annual basis. This is due to the fact that, of course, demand for spectrum continues to evolve quickly, making it absolutely necessary for regulators to constantly reassess the situation. The operators need that information in order to make the right decisions. They need to have a clear view of when and what spectrum is going to be released. They need to be able to predict things like the duration, the annual fees, the renewal procedure. This is very important so that regulators can make the right investment decisions today. Thank you very much, Kemal. Our next speaker is Christina from Ofcom. I think it will be very interesting to hear Ofcom's view. Hello, Christina, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Kirill, for the introduction, and thanks, Kemal, for opening up the discussion on spectrum bands. So, what I would like to take you through in my few slides is the work that Ofcom has done to enable connectivity and innovation through the use of spectrum. So if we can go to the first slide, thank you very much. So one of our objectives in enabling connectivity and innovation is actually making sure that people and businesses have the connectivity where and when they need it. So we've looked at and we've developed our authorization framework to focus not only on consumers and their needs with regard to mobile broadband, but also needs in the industrial sector, needs for manufacturing, for smart cities, logistics, automotive, etc. So what is it that all of these different use cases may require in the future, and how it is that those needs can be met, including, of course, the sort of idea of localized in urban areas or in very, very rural areas. So how is it that we can balance all of those needs and meet this requirement? Next slide, please. What it is that we need to meet all of these requirements is actually a different range of business models. And here is when we have explored a little bit how different use cases may go from using a public network to a private network with everything in between. So there might be a public network delivered by an MNO, a slice of this network offered for specific uses. So there will be a slice that is totally dedicated to consumer, another slice that is dedicated to a specific manufacturing plant in a given area, another slice to provide connectivity within a city. So different slices delivered by MNO to a public network, all the way to the opposite extreme to very, very private network. And again, this will be network built within a specific environment, or very often very, very localized, for which you have completely different needs. If you want a private network, it may be that you want total control over the network, the core, the data over the network, and therefore a high level of security. At the same time, you may have a need to have not only control, but also very, very specific type of devices that you can put in place in your localized network. So the different requirements drive a little bit the choice between the public and the private. And there are many different options in between. There are hybrid solutions with service provider, third party using MNOs, consultants or a system aggregator coming into delivering this type of semi-public or semi-private solution. And at the same time, what I want to point out is that I'm talking about solution. So very often these type of players don't only need connectivity, but need a wider solution in terms of analytics, AI, etc., built on top to deliver the services that they want and therefore deliver innovation. Next slides, please. So it comes without saying, but if you need all of these different business models, some spectrum being available nationwide, some spectrum being available for your manufacturing plant, clearly you need different type of authorization approaches. And what I want to sort of showcase here is the sort of different type of approaches that we've introduced. So clearly we've got the auction band, the bands that have been awarded, and you can see the more traditional mobile bands used by MNO. So you're at 700, 800, 900, 1.4, 1800, etc., up to the 34 to 38. 700 and 34 and 36 to 38 for the UK are to be auctioned next year. All of the other bands are already in the hands of the MNOs, and they provide this wide area coverage. But then we developed last year this local access. Local access, it's sort of shared access. Anyone can have sort of access to a little bit of spectrum in the area where they need that spectrum, in the 1800 megahertz band, where they have got 2 times 3 megahertz of spectrum available, so low power and low capacity type of application, in the 2.3 gigahertz band, where they have got 10 megahertz of spectrum available, therefore they can do some basic data, or in the 38242 gigahertz band over 26, where actually we've got a lot more spectrum. In one case it's 400 megahertz, in the other case is 2 gigahertz of spectrum available. So different type of spectrum, going then to the extreme of the license exempt or light license approach, where again we're trying to sort of lower barrier to innovation, enable as many players as possible to sort of leverage an ecosystem that is out there and use this type of spectrum to deliver new solution, new application. And in particular, I'd like to point out the lower 6 gigahertz band that we've just released in the UK. We've just published our statement on making the lower 6 gigahertz available, and soon we will be making available also the 100 to 200 gigahertz for even more innovative application where you got enormous bandwidth available. So not only different models, but also different bands, and again, different bands to meet the different requirements. If you need a very, very low capacity, wide area type of solution, you might want to go in the lower part of the spectrum. If you need a very, very high capacity, high reliability, low latency, you might want to go in different type of spectrum bands. So we have tried to make a variety of options available so that our stakeholder can choose what helps them meet their own specific requirements. Next slide, please. I wanted to close with you on particularly on the shared spectrum, the localized spectrum, just because this is something that the UK has introduced and has been quite sort of revolutionary in a way, and has been discussed a lot. So what have we done? On top of the 1800, the 2.3, and the 38242 that I've already discussed, so having this very simple mechanism which varies, where we can offer actually both low power and medium power sort of solution, we've also introduced the local access to mobile spectrum held by the MNOs when it's not in use by an MNO. So this will be sort of enabling enable small coverage solutions. So some solutions have been delivered to offer coverage in caravan parks, in touristic destination in the UK where coverage was not available, but it's just sort of enabling something that is a little bit different. Clearly there is a lot of interest in mobile bands. Mobile bands have got nationwide licenses, but our licenses are not exclusive. So we have found a way to become almost like a broker and work with our stakeholders who are keen to access this spectrum, and at the same time work with the MNOs to enable this demand meet supply where it's possible. The licenses are relatively cheap, £950 per license. They are 3-year licenses, but MNOs and new players can agree on longer term, and we're out of that discussion. But we thought there was a good balance to enable innovation and to enable proving a business model to have licenses that last 3 years, and at the same time understand that MNOs might need that cycle in terms of planning their future deployment. So I wanted to close with this just because it's a clear example of how we have tried to sort of find different type of authorization solution across different bands, as I said before, all bands from down to 800, 700 in the future, up to 100 to 200 gigahertz, to make sure that we can meet the requirements, the wide range of requirements from a very diverse set of stakeholders, including both consumers and businesses. So this is it for me. Thank you very much. Over to Kirill again.
Thank you very much, Christina. It was very interesting to hear Ofcom's view on this matter. It was great to hear that Ofcom aims to ensure that there is spectrum available to meet the various use cases. And one way to do that is, of course, to make spectrum available on a shared basis. We all know that regulators often face tough choices regarding spectrum allocation. And I think one of the principles any regulator should be to ensure that the lack of access to radio spectrum is not going to prevent innovation. I think the shared access license framework that you mentioned will make it possible for different users to access spectrum in a number of frequency bands. And of course, it's very interesting to hear about the local access license framework. And I think this has the potential to increase the efficient use of spectrum, of the licensed spectrum. As we know, in the UK, the MNOs have licenses on a national basis. And of course, they're not using that spectrum across the whole in the UK. It's often the case, especially in the high frequencies, that there are large areas where the frequencies are not used by the MNOs. And if there's interest from the local communities in that spectrum, why not allow them to use that? Thank you very much, Christina. Absolutely exciting. So our next speaker is Mandiali Bodian. Hello, Mandiali. I think maybe
Kirill.
in a few seconds. Hello, Maniali. Over to you. The stage is all yours.
Well, thank you, Kirill. Good morning to all. So it's my pleasure, and I'm humbled to participate to this fifth Sub-Saharan conference on spectrum management. So I'll give the view of as a regulator, because I'm working for IRTP, which is the regulatory authority in telecoms and post sectors. So I'll give my views onto our presentation of today on the priorities for regulators bringing spectrum into use. So this presentation, we can go to the next slide, please. Will be articulated around 5 points. First of all, we'll show the strategy to build a digital society. Then we'll show some key elements to be noted on I'll say on the African telecommunication environment, and more we'll say the Senegalese case that I know more. Then I'll show a summary of things available for mobile service, their current usage and planned one. Then we'll talk about the priorities and strategies on spectrum and the impact of COVID-19 on spectrum release. Next slide, please. So in Senegal, the Senegalese case is the one that I know more, but Senegal being Africa, we all share the same realities at some differences, some detailed differences. So due to the awareness of the benefits on the economy of building a digital society, the Senegalese government put up a strategy in 2016 called Stratégie Sénégal Numérique 2016 to 2025. The aims of that strategy is that by 2025, make the digital available for all and for all uses in Senegal. The second thing is to make the digital sector contribute by 10% to the GDP, versus around that time it was like at 5% in 2016. So 4 axes of priority were defined. I'll underline 2 of them that for me are connected to the others, is then to make available open and affordable access to digital networks and services, and to promote an innovative digital industry that creates value. We can go to the next slide, please. So then I'll talk to understand more the how we deal with the priorities, or we choose this or that. We have to understand one thing on is the environment. So there I'll just underline right now some of the details or the key elements onto our African telecommunications ecosystem or environment on the Senegalese case. So the majority of internet connections are made via mobile networks, due to a weak percentage of penetration of ADSL and fiber optics. If we see in Senegal, for example, the internet penetration rate is high, is 81%, but as we can see, the internet lines are at 98.73% mobile. So that means that the mobile dominates, or almost it takes all, you know. So when we have this, so some important, it is important that our environment being like this, we have to see what to do. So some important facts to underline here are that we have 3G networks rolled out already and operating all around Africa. But now we see that the 3G networks are more popular than the 4G for internet connection, due first of all to the availability of networks. So then we talk about also the frequency or the bandwidth availability, and also due to the affordability of smartphones. The smartphones, as we know, in 4G are more expensive for 4G than 3G. So the other fact to underline here is important to see that we noticed that 4 years ago, since 2016, that the data traffic is going up while the voice is going down. And despite more resources used for the mobile, because the operators in some points, they need more resources that as per because in the environment, since there are less access through ADSL or FO, so people are more using the mobile networks, which make congestions, especially into crowded areas. So the operators, we see that they still need to offload data traffic via Wi-Fi network, for example, despite more resources need or put to their disposal. So some needs were identified. So we need more frequency resources than in the countries where the fixed connections are available. There's a need also of a mix of type of connections. It's important to set up a strategy to make the terminals available. And we think also, and it's already here in Senegal, we already work on that. And it's already something that exists here, the refarming of the 2G bands due to the change of traffic type. We can go to the next slide, please. So summary of the bands available for the mobile service, their current usage and their planned usage show us that, all of those bands that we already talked about are here and used already. For example, for the 2G bands, I'll just say that they are used, and we see that the refarming for IMT usage is already applied here. I'll explain more lately. But what is important to know is that some bands already identified IMT, and especially for 5G, since 5G is now the current business where we are going, are still used by some other technologies. So the challenge is how to make them be available and to reframe the spectrum that is available for the IMTs. So we can go to the next slide, please. Then considering the priorities and strategies on spectrum, it is simple. For us, some bands are already allocated to IMT available. It's important to make them be available because the studies are already here and we know that they can be used there. While the challenge that we're having here is that in many countries in the sub-Saharan Africa have not yet completed the transition to DTV, digital TV, for example, or the WiMAX is used under 3.5. So we have to work on those to make them available. Then after that, due also to our the characteristics of the environment, knowing that we use more mobile
We seem to have lost Mandiali, possibly. I think, unfortunately, we've lost the connection with Mandiali there. So we'll try and get that back. I think he was coming towards the end of his. Oh, hang on, I can see. Maybe let me just try one more time. Are you there, Mandiali?
Yes. Oh, I'm sorry.
Perfect.
I was just about to wrap up.
We lost your connection for a second, so I'll bring your slides back up. And if you wanted to conclude, that's absolutely fine. We just lost your connection, so I'll bring your slides back up.
All right. Well, sorry about it. So quickly, the mechanisms that we use as regulators to ensure viable environment are usually the harmonized ITU recommendation, the audits of spectrum, benchmarking to evaluate the spectrum in respect to the characteristic, because each environment has its like specificities, and insisting here in Senegal onto the quality of service with the present technologies and pursuing the deployment. Next challenge is starting 5G in urban areas and organize the environment, especially the framework, the juridical framework, reframing 2G bands, seeing where we can use licensed and unlicensed networks. We can go to the next slide, please, which is going to be the last one. To talk quickly about the COVID-19 on spectrum release. COVID-19, we saw that we work more from home, we learn more from home. So what happened is that we had a change, we noticed a change into the mapping of traffic distribution. So there's an increase of data traffic in residential area where the voice is lowering down. So some choices were made here, for example, and we saw it with the A2. So in Senegal, for example, we have the soft refarming solution, which is to use your 2G band refarmed into, depending on to what you need and into the geographical areas for data or for voice, or in some areas you have like temporary authorizations of some IMT bands available, free or at a reduced cost. And finally, the usage of some new technologies like HAPS in Kenya and Mozambique that are used in Kenya and Mozambique that we saw as an example to ease and improve connections and access to the population. So which terminates my presentations. I think I'll respond to some questions after that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mandial. It was very insightful to hear ARTP's perspective on that matter. I think you mentioned something like 98% of all connections are mobile and fixed is less than 2%. I guess this is especially problematic now given the current COVID-19 situation. As we know, COVID-19 has led to a substantial increase in data consumption, and we've seen traffic increases around the world. And we often hear quotes in the range of +20 to a +100% increase in the traffic. But however, we typically see that the largest share of the traffic increase has been absorbed by fixed. And I guess it's particularly problematic if there is no fixed to absorb the traffic increase. Thank you very much for that presentation. That was very good. Our final speaker is Abdurrahmane El Hajar from the Telecommunications Regulatory Board in Cameroon. Hello, Abdurrahmane.
Hello,
And the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Kirill. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. I am Abdurrahmane El Hajar from the Telecommunication Regulatory Board from Cameroon. I've seen that the previous speakers have already set the stage. There is not much left to say. So normally I should not have to add something else. But since I have prepared some thoughts that I would like to share with you, I will do it. My opening remarks will be based on the views of our views as regulators, and it will be also taken into account some of the information that we have shared amongst regulators in Central Africa. So the idea behind is just to have a snapshot of the situation that we have in our sub-region, and also try to share with you some of our thoughts about how we can maybe move forward, because it is important for the regulators to create the right regulatory environment and incentives that will allow operators to launch the latest generation of higher speed mobile broadband networks, including making the necessary spectrum available. So next slide, please. So that's why, for example, when we are looking for 5G, there are high expectations on 5Gs, because 5Gs is supposed to bring improved end user experience and also new application, new business model. And then we will have also improved network performance and reliability. So all these factors are really important for us, because we are also in a process of going towards a digital society, and there are great expectations around that. And we see that the high speed technology like the 5G could also help us to move towards this goal. And when we are looking at the situation currently in Central Africa regarding the allocation and of specific spectrum for 5G, yet there has not been a spectrum license for 5G mobile networks in Central Africa. What I will say, mainly the points that we are going to raise in our presentation, they are pertaining to Central Central African region, but also I think it's quite the same situation. Situations are quite similar all around sub-Saharan Africa. And when we look at what is currently existing, we will see that there is only an announcement of a 5G pilot project that has been launched in Gabon, but for the other countries in Central Africa, there is no perspective on that. Next slide, please. This slide will provide you with some more information about the current use of the wireless broadband technology. And first, we have identified the main technology which are in use in those specific frequency bands. And you will see that it's not all those technologies are not implemented in all the countries. Some of the countries, they have other system, or even some of these bands are free. But what we are seeing as priority for the development, for the implementation of 5G in the short and the medium term are low band frequency bands. It means that the frequency bands below 1 gig. In particular, the 700 megahertz bands. We are in the process of the switch over to digital of the use from this band. They are still, I think it's in some countries, it's around 1 or 2 countries where they are still analog TV, but normally the spectrum should be free and should be available for 5G. Also, we have some spectrum also in the 800 megs, but we know that in the 800 megahertz, we have our LTE system which has been deployed, 4G systems. I think they will continue to run up, but for the countries who have not yet implemented 4G system, this plan could also be available for the 5G. But what is new and what is really important from our perspective is the L band, because in the L band, yet we have most of the systems which are there. We have some radio relay system there which are non-wireless access systems, but there are few. So it means that most of the spectrum in that part are free. So it can be used for implementation of the higher speed technology, 4G, 5G. But I think the goal could be to go straight to 5G there. Another spectrum also which could be useful for 4G or 5G is the 2.3 gigahertz. For now, we have some WiMAX systems which are operating there, but also there are TG-LTE systems. But we've seen them as a good spectrum that could be used for future in the short term for implementation of IMG or also for 4G. And the next part is 2.5 gig also, which is not much used in some countries. So it means that there are possibility to develop an ecosystem for LTE or IMG 2020 there. We have also the 3.3 gig, the C band. Normally that goes from 3.3 to 3.6, where also there are some opportunity also to allow the mobile networks there. Most of this spectrum is currently used by WiMAX systems. They are used to provide fixed wireless access. But as a priority, those are the range of spectrum that are seen as implementable for 5G in the short term, or even to address the needs for 5G in the medium term. Next slide, please. When we are looking for spectrum for future, now the first question was about the focus. Focus should be on 5G or strengthening the deployment of 3G, 4G. Our view is that 5G should stand on the success of 3G and 4G mobile networks, and we all know that for 5G, we have some barriers from the fact that the implementation of 5G networks may need some new investment, and also 5G will not be available for all the areas in countries. So that's why our view is that Even though we can jump to 5G, we should also strengthen the existing system, for in particular the 4G system, in order to allow, for example, for rural areas or underserved areas to benefit from the possibility of having access to higher data rate systems. So even though 5G is a way to go, but we should not forget the fact that we should also work on the availability and the quality of the existing 3G and 4G systems. And when it's come to the question of identifying new spectrum, is it a go or no go? Our point of view is that yes, first of all, we should try to work in order to release the existing spectrum for 5G, but at the same time, also we should also look forward. From the consultation we had with our operators, for example, in Cameroon, they have expressed little interest for the millimeter wave band. So it means that the spectrum, which is above 20 gig for the time being, they are not seeing as an option for the implementation of 5G in the short or medium term. It's a long-term issue. That's why our preference will go also. We know that during the last WRC, we have an agenda item for future spectrum for IMT, and they focus one of the spectrum band which is included are the spectrum between 6 to 10 gig. So this will be a question of interest for all, because we think that the mid-range frequency are all a good option for the start for the 5G in the short and medium term. Next slide, please. Yes, what are the challenges for the 5G take-up? First, we know that its backbones are essential and critical to allow the high-speed deployment of services. That's why this is one of the challenge that we had in our Africa, in our region. So infrastructure deployment should be increased. For example, for the fiber backbone and also the international connectivity. Another challenge is the cost, which are needed for investment. That is also a challenge which has to be addressed by the policymakers. And we all know that also the devices are also the drivers from an ecosystem. So it's really important to have device available to allow that. But it's not the current situation. As you have seen, we have several frequency band. In some of these frequency band, for example, the L band, we do not have yet devices available and affordable, because affordability also is something which is important. And we have also to work on the 5G use cases and application which are relevant to Africa. That's something which is really important. I think this one will be one of the key drivers for the demand or for 5G application. And I'm sure that it's something that the policymakers and also the operators and the regulators should work in. Then it will allow for a streamlined development of these new technologies. When it comes to the tools for the operators, there are several tools, and in my presentation, I have shown some of them. We have, for example, the spectrum refarming, as was mentioned by Bojan in his presentation, is quite the same as mine. We've seen that some of the spectrum which can be useful for the new technology, we have some systems which are operating there now. A good way to go is to try to implement some spectrum refarming process and allow to release the spectrum to allow for the 5G. Another point also is the spectrum pricing policy. We know that this is a key point for operators. Spectrum should be made available, but policymakers also and the regulators should work in a way to have a balance between the cost for the access to the spectrum and also the other obligation on the operators, in particular the obligation which are linked to the availability or the coverage obligation, because coverage obligations are really important in order not to increase the digital dividend between the urban areas or rural areas in the same countries. And the last tool is about the non-market based assignments. I know that among the best practices, there is a points that auction are considered to be amongst the best practices. But some experience that we had in some countries in Africa show that when auctions were conducted, the process has failed. I'm not sure whether it's going to is the best way for some countries in Africa. We have another possibility, and one of the methods that has been used, for example, in Cameroon, is the fact that we did not go for an auction process. What has happened is that all the operators have been given the opportunity to have spectrum for 4G. So it means that it means that the idea is to promote more competition between the existing operators by allowing each of them to have access to the spectrum. So I think that is another way of doing, instead of only focusing on the auction, as we see more regularly in the different presentation about the best way for assignment for this spectrum. So those were my methods, and I thank you for following me. I'm available for the question. Back to you, Kirill. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this presentation, Abdurrahmane. That was a very good summary from you on a number of points. It was interesting to hear about your point of view of where the focus of rollout of mobile networks should be, whether we should focus on 3G, 4G, and 5G. And of course, I entirely agree with your point that 5G should be built on strong 3G and 4G networks. And of course, given the high cost of 5G, rollouts are likely to be prioritized in the urban areas. Operators in the region are not only facing high implementation costs, but it's difficult for them to pass these costs to already very price-conscious consumers. And we've seen this in a number of developed markets. In Korea, we haven't seen an ARPU uplift for 5G, and I can imagine why this is a particular challenge for the region. It is also fascinating to hear some of the challenges in front of 5G in the region. I think one of the key challenges in front of 5G should be the availability and the affordability of end-user devices. I hope we'll have the opportunity to kind of touch base on this again during our discussion. Thank you very much, Abdurrahmane, and indeed, thank you very much all for these excellent introductions. Just in mind, before we move to the Q&A session, I would like to kind of invite everyone to kind of, if they have any points they would like to pick on from the other panelists, so if they have indeed any questions for them. In the meantime, just a reminder that our audience can ask questions using the chat function. I've already seen that there are some questions coming in, some very interesting questions. Let's see how many of the questions we have time to address. But before we move to the Q&A, kind of, I would like to give you the opportunity to kind of, if you have any points on the other presentations, so if indeed if you have any questions for the other panelists, I think it might be best if you kind of start in the same order. So if you kind of can I take the liberty to kind of ask Kamal the first question, and then I'll give the floor to everyone else if they want to comment on his thoughts. So Kamal, in your presentation, we talked a lot about the importance of a good spectrum roadmap. I think besides providing an indication of when and what spectrum is going to be released in the market, it's very important for a good spectrum roadmap to be available, to be able to give a fair indication about the likely spectrum prices. It's good to know that spectrum is going to be available in a couple of years' time, but if the price of that spectrum is not right for you, then actually it might have been a poor investment decision on your side to wait for that spectrum. And of course, I understand it's very difficult to predict the outcome of and the price of an auction that's happening next week, and let alone in a couple of years' time. But what can we do to increase the certainty of spectrum prices for future awards, so that operators can make the most efficient decisions today? And of course, how can we do that and still award the spectrum in a way that generates the most social economic benefit? Over to you.
I think possibly Kamal has frozen. We maybe lost his connection there. So let me just bring him down.
I guess let's wait for a few seconds. And if not, we can ask Christina. I think there's a question for the audience for Christina. So maybe let's quickly ask Christina that question, and then we can move to Kamal. Let me quickly find that question. So, Christina, how many takers has Ofcom had so far for its local access license in the MNO spectrum?
Yes, thanks, Kirill, and hi, Cesar, by the way, who is asking the question. We had a few. I think we're 5, 6 at the moment. Not many. Some have been higher profile than others. For example, Vodafone and Opencell were quite public on their own sharing of spectrum. But we're talking still about small numbers. But there are more that are on the pipeline that we know already. But I cannot really mention this. So it is happening, and we're seeing it picking up.
Okay, thank you very much. While we're speaking to you, maybe one more question for you. So my understanding is at the moment there are 4 different spectrum bands that are available under the shared access license framework. That's the 1800, 2.3, I think 3.8 to 4.2 in the 26 gigahertz.
Yes.
How much bandwidth is actually approximately available in these bands for shared access license? I'm assuming in the 3.8 to 4.2, given the large bandwidth available in this range, users can apply for options ranging from, I don't know, 10 megahertz to even 100 megahertz. On the other hand, I think the 1800, most of this isn't actually allocated to MNOs. I think only BT holds around 90 megahertz in the band. And this is my first question, kind of as a follow-up. What are Ofcom's plans for these spectrum bands in the future? Is Ofcom going to look to make more bandwidth available or kind of is going to look for additional spectrum bands?
Thanks, Carol. So we've got different bandwidths across the different bands available. So in the 1800, it's 3.2 times 3.3 megahertz. This is the old DECGAR band used in the UK. So it's the smallest sliver of spectrum in between the band that is allocated to the MNOs. So this is spectrum that could be used for voice, but it's very small bandwidth. In the 2.3, we're talking about 10 megahertz. In the 3.8-4.2, we're talking about the entirety of the 400 megahertz of spectrum that are available, and it can be authorized in the 10, 20, up to, I think, 100 megahertz bands, and the cost is on £80 per any 10 megahertz, and in the case of the 1.8 is also £80 for the 3.3 megahertz, and 2.3 is £80 for the only 10 megahertz available. And this is cost-based. It's a fee that we have developed to purely recover our cost. In the 26 gigahertz, we're talking about 2.25 gigahertz of spectrum available. And if I remember correctly, the bandwidth starts from 50, 100 to 200 megahertz are available in that slot. And again, it's a lot of spectrum is indoor only. In the case of 2.3 and 26 gigahertz is indoor only. In the case of 1800 and 3.8-4.2 is indoor and outdoor. And in particularly in the 3.8 to 4.2, you've got both low power and medium power sort of solution available. Low power available everywhere, but medium power available mainly in a rural area to store because of the interference environment with satellite station and fixed links in the band. And it's all in the 3.8 to 4.2 on a first come first served basis. So whoever arrives there can have the license. It's an indefinite license. You just need to pay annually. And your frequency range could be changed. And now I forgot. Was there another question that I forgot because I've spoken too long?
The other question is, what is the plan for the future?
Yes. So we've said it clearly in our statement on this. We will look to apply this framework to other bands where we think it is feasible, where the new use case and the existing use cases could coexist. So it's something that we hope and we plan to implement in other bands as well.
Thank you very much, Christina. Kamal, are you okay? Would you be able to hear us now?
Yes, apologies. My connectivity went off for a second there whilst you were right in the middle of asking the question.
That's perfectly fine. How much of the question were you able to hear?
Just the beginning when you started speaking.
So I think the question was, I think it's, besides knowing when and what spectrum is going to be available, it's very good for it's very important for a spectrum roadmap to be able to give a fair indication of the likely spectrum prices, and how can we kind of increase the certainty of that and still allocate the spectrum in a way that generates the most socio-economic benefit.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And the thing with spectrum roadmaps is traditionally what they tend to do is try to give an indication of when spectrum is going to be available and how it's going to be made available. And like you also highlighted, it remains an available document that is updated annually, considering current circumstances and new developments. But one area as well that we've seen some spectrum roadmaps delve into is in the area of making pronouncements on spectrum pricing. Now, naturally, you wouldn't expect to see a spectrum roadmap specifically state what prices are going to be charged for access to spectrum, but you do see broad-based statements being made around what direction the country intends to take in terms of how it's going to address spectrum pricing going forward. So we've seen spectrum roadmaps in New Zealand, for example, that have set out to gradually reduce the cost of spectrum licenses over a number of years, and getting to a point where they're going to adopt a simple principle of only cost recovery. So that basically is a recognition of the fact that they see the need to revisit the pricing policy that they're currently adopting, and also adopting a sensible approach towards looking for a change in that direction. Australia, I think, as well, have done something similar in that there was a legislative review around spectrum pricing in the country, and the roadmap set out to review the outcomes of that exercise, and also seek to implement the recommendations out of that review process. So there are ways with which a spectrum roadmap can look to address spectrum pricing. In Africa, one of the key areas where you find service providers hemorrhaging investment funds is in pricing of backhaul spectrum, for example. It's one of the areas that is popularly ignored when spectrum pricing is being talked about, because you find that most of the conversations are around access spectrum. But indeed, backhaul spectrum, it's very important for regulators as well to begin to think about how to make easier access and cheaper, cost-effective access to backhaul spectrum, such that it helps to drive the new innovations that we're seeing in technology, the greater deployment of 4G networks, and also the introduction of 5G networks. And the area where they can do that is in making clear, simple statements in a spectrum roadmap that indicates that there's going to be a revisit of the formulas. Usually you find that these spectrum bands are priced based on formulas. So perhaps you can find roadmaps, make clear statements around the need to revisit the formulas that are currently used to charge spectrum fees in terms of backhaul spectrum. And I suppose maybe there's no need to harp on about auctions if they ever happen, and the need to also adopt sensible approaches towards selecting or setting reserve prices. We have done quite a number of studies in the past on spectrum prices in developing markets. We continue to do them. Next year, later this year, we're going to release a new report on spectrum pricing. But suffice to say that in the past, one of the studies that we have conducted on spectrum pricing in developing markets has indicated that in developing markets, you find that final prices for spectrum are 3 times more than what you find in developed countries. And also, you find that the reserve prices that are set for auctions are more than 5 times what you find in developing countries. And this is especially when you take into account income levels. So there's clearly a problem of spectrum pricing, and it's a problem that needs to be approached from different facets, different angles. And one of such angles is definitely a spectrum roadmap. It's a clear indication to industry that government is listening. Government has recognized that this is a problem, and government intends to solve this problem. And naturally, that will help with risk management from an investor's perspective. And you'll find that there'll be more readiness in finding funding to invest in deployment of infrastructure in the region.
Thank you very much. Let's move to the questions from the audience. So one of the questions: regulators should remove technology constraints and existing allocated bands and refarm. To what extent this is happening within the continent? Anyone interested in that question?
Well, Well, it is. Well, I can a bit answer this. I think that, well, from Bashir Patel, thank you, Bashir, for that question. I think that it is a reality now, to the technology constraints, and we are living that actually in our environment in Senegal. I mean, the technology constraints were like using like those bands for the base technology, if I can say so. But we see that now with scarcity, if I can say so. You know, I'm a French speaker then, but I'm trying English. Huh? Sometimes some terms are a bit translated from French to English, but if they don't exist about that, I'm not from the academy. But those resources, you know, they are scarce, and we have to find ways to have. And as you see, sometimes you go and you find more, but they don't like fit. They don't fit or they don't respond. So we have to be a bit innovative, and I think that those constraints have in Senegal, for example, and I think all around across Africa, we're working into removing those constraints, making neutrality technology into the bands, meaning that we can use you know, the band is fixed on a technology. So I agree with that, and we apply that in Senegal in some case. But again, you remove that, but you have to. That's when I was presenting, I was talking about like harmonizing like the usage of it, because you know, we go through different speeds. Sometimes you have 3G here, and your neighbor, for example, 4G, but your neighbor hasn't like launched a 4G network. What will you do around the borders? Creates problems, you know, and those are some cases that we so we have to be like innovative, and you know, why we have to do that, but again, define how and put a framework onto that. I won't be long on that. That's my answer to that. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Mandela, for this insightful answer. Does anyone want to contribute before we move to the next question?
Yeah, maybe I could add to Mandiali's point. I mean, he's highlighted very clearly that the need to allow technology neutrality to be able to facilitate a lot of innovation. But besides innovation as well, especially for our continent, one thing that we should also realize technology neutrality helps to do is coverage, helping to address the coverage gap. I've cited this example a couple of times, but I'll do that once again here. Back in 2014, the coverage gap in sub-Saharan Africa was only about 48%, right? About 50. There was mobile broadband coverage for more than 50% of the population, and by 2015, that had jumped a few points up to 45%. The gap had been reduced by 3%, and again in 2016, it had also dropped again by another 3-4%. Similar situation by 2017, another 3%. So we're now at 37%. But in 2018, what we observed at the GSMA was that coverage gap had dropped significantly from 37% to 30%. And even though our analysts looked into it, and there were a number of factors that contributed to it, one of the key contributors as well that they sought to see that contributed to this was in the fact that around that same time in Ghana, the regulator had allowed the use of 900 megahertz band, which is currently assigned for on technology-specific basis to 2G. They had allowed that spectrum band to be used for 3G in rural areas, in unserved and underserved areas. So they had adopted a sort of partial technology neutral framework specifically for those areas. And that basically helped operators to be able to deploy cost-effective infrastructure to be able to provide to be able to bridge coverage gaps in those sorts of areas. So you can see in these sorts of instances how allowing technology neutrality, allowing operators to be able to use spectrum that they currently have assigned for the most suitable cases. I mean, the difference basically is clear in terms of the impact that it has where you have technology-specific licensing regimes as against to where you have technology-neutral licensing regimes. So, I mean, there's really no gainsaying in the fact that really by 2020 we should be a lot further ahead in terms of adopting technology-neutral licensing practices in the region.
Thank you very much, Paul. So let's quickly kind of discuss the poll. I think, so the poll was what bands should be prioritized by regulators when looking at key spectrum to make available. I think this has been discussed a lot today and thus far in the conference. So I'm sure that the answer is not going to be a surprise to you, but so 700 megahertz, 41%, 800 megahertz, 9%, 1800 megahertz, 0%, 2.6, 18%, and 3.5, 27%, millimeter wave, 5%. So anyone kind of want to quickly summarize this result?
Coverage. The coverage gap needs to be bridged, basically, and people recognize that to be able to build to bridge that coverage gap, you need low band spectrum, and right now the most accessible low band spectrum band is the 700 megahertz band. So that's why it's very, very important. And I mean, without us on the panel saying it, you can hear it's basically the audience saying, you know, that digital switchover process needs to be completed as soon as possible, so that spectrum band can be made available, and then that coverage can be built. I'm sorry, Christina, I think I might have cut you off just before you started speaking, but yeah.
Christina, if you want to add something.
Yes, I just wanted to reflect. I totally agree, Kamal. I think that's the driver. It's interesting with a European perspective. We have seen both 700 and the C band as the two primary band for 5G, whilst here we're seeing a smaller sort of focus potentially on C band, which is the band that has been released across more countries, let's say in Europe. So I found this quite interesting. I kind of share the 26 gigahertz, 5%. We have made it available for innovation, but it's true that MNOs have been potentially more focused on the mid-frequency spectrum in the case of Europe than necessarily on the 26 gigahertz.
Thank you very much. Anyone else want to contribute to that before we move on?
I think that perhaps Abdurrahman, he's on mute. Abdurrahman.
You're muted. Yeah.
You're muted, Abdurrahman. You're still muted. I think today, unfortunately, Abdurrahman has no technical.
All have been said. I won't add on anything on that. That's coverage, and you know we see that the 3.5 gigahertz. Sometimes you have less fights in some bands too. So people go to identify what is clear, and the other one is coverage and it's available. But again, the challenge in Africa, for example, is that 700 megahertz is to free it, to free those bands or move the technology and make it be available. Yeah, that's why. So I won't add on. Kamal and Christina have already said it all. So yeah, perhaps Abdurrahman. I don't.
Abdurrahman, did you manage to fix your
yes,
technical?
I think I am the same line. Do you hear me? Is it fine now?
We can hear.
Okay. So what I was going to say is that I think it's quite close to what was presented during my introductory remarks. So the views, even from the regulators, is that the lower frequency band and the mid range are the priority band for the 5G deployment, and also 5G has to be built. For example, for the 1800 megs, there is a 0%. So, and we know that in Africa, particularly when I'm looking for the situation, this particular situation in Central Africa, those band, the lower frequency band and even the mid-range frequency band are less congested. It means that they are not much used on that frequency band. Most of the existing systems are fixed wireless system, for example, and based mainly on WiMAX. So there are ways to reach that spectrum to allow for 5G or for new technology. I think that's the move, and that's also what operators, when we are engaging with them, they are looking for. They are waiting for that.
Thank you very much. I think we're pretty much close to now, so I think we have time for maybe one last question. So one question is, I heard a presenter indicating that spectrum auctions seems not to be the best option to license the spectrum. So what is the proposed alternative to license the highly demanded spectrum?
I know that it was linked to what I have said during my presentation. What I was trying to mean is that one size will not fit all. That's why I was saying, for example, for some environment, it's possible to go with the auction, but it's not going to be possible for everywhere in enough different countries with different level of development in Africa, with different environment. So that's what I was saying. So if it is possible to run an auction, close the door to other possibility. For example, what I've heard from the presentation from Christina, what has been implemented, the other authorization process implemented in UK, for example, we are already implementing it in Cameroon, because we have allowed for some part of the spectrum to operators, even for the ISP. So this means that it's a process that we have already in place. Some of them need only to be strengthened, but auction should not be seen as the only way to do. That's why I'm saying we have other option. That's why I say one of the classical option was beauty contest, but other option also is for depending of what the government is looking for, the socioeconomic benefits. That's why, for example, that's what I explained about Cameroon is that the decision that has been made is that we have three or four operators. Each of them they will have access to the spectrum in a different frequency bands. Then we will allow more competition in the service that they will offer. Competition will not be on the access to the spectrum, but competition will be on the service offer with that spectrum. We did not go for an action process to allow for the rollout of the 3G and 4G mobile networks. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So does anyone has anything to contribute to that? I would appreciate a 60-second answer, or we should get back to Dan.
I can take a quick shot. Maybe yes. Just to sort of somewhat align with Abdurrahman's submission. I think indeed it's not a one size fits all. Auctions are not always the answer. However, if you have a situation where you have a lot more demand than you have supply, auctions will remain the best and most transparent way for you to be able to assign spectrum to the highest value to people who value it the most. And that's where, of course, when you begin to also have conversations around reserve prices. But that said, the core of the decision making in terms of what methodology you adopt should be on how much demand there is and how much spectrum you actually have. If you do not have enough demand to meet the supply that you currently have, obviously there's no point in having an auction. You can let the spectrum be available on a first come first served basis or beauty contest or whatever the case may be. But as long as there's going to be more demand than supply, then really I think you would really struggle to be able to find any more transparent, clear, simple ways that you'll be able to assign spectrum other than an auction.
Thank you very much, Kamal, and thank you very much indeed to all of you. That was a very interesting presentations from all of you and very interesting discussion we had. I'll let Dan kind of close that session. Dan, over to you.
Thank you, Kirill. Thank you very much. And to echo what Kirill has said there as well, I would like to add my thanks to all of our panelists for that session. So. Yet again, another fascinating session, and I think a great way to wrap up the main plenary sessions for the conference. So thank you all very much, and really do appreciate your involvement. And again, yes, some really interesting discussions. And thank you again to all of you in the audience for the questions as well, which again was really appreciated. So some great discussion there. So that now is just about it for our panels and presentations, but we're not quite finished yet because we're delighted now to be able to open our closing ceremony. So we now have around about 20 minutes or so where we're going to have some discussion with speakers here before we pass over to yourselves in the audience again for you to have the final say and have the final comments from the floor. So here we have on the screen here the schedule for the closing ceremony. So in a second, I'm going to be welcoming to the stage Jean-Pierre Faison from Broadcast Networks Europe. So BNE have sponsored and hosted networking receptions at a number of our spectrum management conferences across different regions around the world, and we're really grateful to them for continuing hosting the sessions into this new virtual environment that we find ourselves in nowadays. So they hosted the reception at our European conference, and we're very grateful to BNE for once again hosting the reception here. So very shortly, I'm going to be passing over to Jean-Pierre Faison for some welcome remarks. Following that, we will have some closing comments from two prestigious speakers. So we have Andrew Rugeji, who obviously was with us yesterday to moderate a session, and that was a fantastic session that Andrew moderated yesterday. So Andrew will be back with us. He is, of course, Regional Director for Africa at the ITU. And then we're delighted to be joined by Dick Christophe Suiwa, who's the chairperson of ICTA in Mauritius. So as many of you may be aware, we were planning to hold this conference this year in Mauritius, but for obvious reasons, the global pandemic meant that wasn't possible. But we're delighted still to have ICTA as a virtual partner for the event this year, and we look forward to hearing what the chairperson of ICTA, what Dick has to say very shortly. And then, although we're not in Mauritius, we thought it would be quite nice to just have a taste of some of the Mauritian culture to finish the event. So we do have some traditional Mauritian entertainment. We have some of that to show you in around about 15 minutes or so before, as I say, we move to the final Have Your Say session and give you that last word. So without further ado, I would now like to welcome to the stage Jean-Pierre Faison. Jean-Pierre, welcome. As I said, we really are grateful to BNE for once again hosting this closing reception, and I'd like to pass you the floor to give some opening remarks and maybe some thoughts on the outcomes and your key conclusions from the conference as well. So over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks very much, Dan. And I think I speak on behalf of all the attendees to thank our hosts, the ITU, the ATU, ICTA Mauritius, and Forum Global for organizing such a successful conference. I represent Broadcast Networks Europe, which is the trade association for terrestrial broadcast operators. We provide transmission services to the content owners, the broadcasters. In Europe, digital terrestrial television is #1 platform, and we are extremely interested to observe what is going on in the rest of Region 1. And we are particularly happy to witness the strong dynamics of digital terrestrial television in sub-Saharan Africa. To give just a number, since 2015, 20 new countries have launched DTT projects. We think this is great. And what we realize in such a conference is that it is only one part of many projects which are happening throughout the continent. A strong dynamics, very ambitious, to keep on making Africa a more connected continent for its citizens. And what an energy comes out of such a conference. Just to say a final word on this closing ceremony, as you said, Dan, the circumstances are, of course, particular this year. Last year, we were at a cocktail reception in Botswana. Obviously, it was not possible. So I think I'm very grateful. We at BNE and altogether, I think all our hosts are grateful to you and our virtual hosts for coming with inventivity to a way to have some local touch of social and culture event. I think this is very important because in the end, this is also what helps people understand each other. And I think this is what those conferences are all about. So thank you very much and welcome for this closing ceremony.
Jean-Pierre, thank you so much, and yeah, once again, we really do appreciate your support of the opening ceremony, and yeah, really appreciate your involvement in the event once again this year. So thank you, and thank you to all of your colleagues at BNE as well. So next, I would like to bring to the stage our two keynote speakers who are going to be providing some closing comments for the reception, maybe on some of their conclusions from the event and maybe some of the takeaways and key thoughts that they have. So I'd like to bring up to the stage, first of all, Andrew Rugeji, who is the Regional Director for Africa at the ITU. Andrew, welcome. And I'd also like to bring up Mr. Dick Suiwa, who is the Chairperson of ICTA in Mauritius. So hello, welcome to you as well, Dick. So welcome. So I think both ITU and ICTA have been valued partners at the conference this year, and we're honoured to have both you, Andrew, and Dick with us for this closing session. So first of all, I would like to invite Andrew to take the stage and provide some comments and thoughts on some of your key outcomes. Andrew, I mean, the session, you actually moderated a session for us yesterday, and I think the session that you moderated was fantastic with some really interesting discussions. And I just wanted to mention that we did have a specific number of comments from the audience in the chat saying how inspired they were by some of the messages that you were laying out in your keynote presentation. So we were really grateful for you for your participation yesterday, and also for you returning today to participate in this closing ceremony and maybe giving us some conclusions from the conference itself. So without further ado, Andrew, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dan, and thank you for the kind comments. I appreciate those. Ladies and gentlemen, we are coming to the end of a wonderful and very, very inspiring conference. And it is my privilege to give you just a review or summary, a short summary of what was discussed. I will not give you everything. I suppose there will be a report, so you have to bear with me. Session 1, which was on the 14th, fireside chat, looking back at WRC 19. It is important to say that all speakers paid tribute to Egypt for a very, very successful WRC conference, notably for the African delegation and the sub-Saharan region. The session recalled that new bands were identified for IMT. I'm not going to go through those. Africa, through ATU, is developing recommendations on the implementations of these bands for 5G and for other emerging technologies. Facilitation of the new high-altitude platform hubs in terms of additional spectrum was also discussed. But emphasis was given to the increasing contribution of African ladies in the radio communication sector, for which, if I could, I would clap. Session 2 was on starting on the paths towards WRC 23, ITUR studies, as well as regional groups preparations are on track towards WRC 23, despite COVID-19 challenges. UHF band, C-band, and 6 gigahertz band among the most highly debated issues for WRC 23 in the sub-Saharan region. Session 3 was on focusing on C-band. To what extent is coexistence of spectrum and mobile services a reality in the 3.6 gigahertz to 3.8? The panel agreed that the coexistence between satellite and mobile may only be possible in the rural areas, but not where it most matters, in the cities and more densely populated areas. The panelists were divided on whether the sub-bands should continue to be used for satellite or repurposed for the mobile in Africa. The polls showed about 50-50 split. Session 4, managing spectrum in times of crisis, tools and techniques to keep societies connected. This was a very, very important session on lessons learned, and it included the licensing, or the measures that were taken included the licensing of temporary radio frequency spectrum to address capacity constraints experienced by mobile networks. Spectrum fee waivers supported rapid deployment of infrastructure, eased wayleave and type approval processing. The recommendation for moving forward was sub-Saharan countries should consider developing disaster recovery plans, which will include a set of policy and regulatory reforms, availability of PPDR spectrum, and others. Session 5, maximizing the potential of the UHF band for all users. General agreement on the importance of ensuring that both the 800 megahertz and the 700 megahertz spectrum bands are assigned to operators as soon as possible across the region was made and supported. And this is despite the legacy of CDMA and others that are holding it back. DTT and TV white space solutions for rural connectivity provide variable incumbent services excuse me, in the sub 700 megahertz band, the 470 to 694 portion of the UHF. And so it is not clear when and how much more spectrum should be allocated to IMT going forward. The audience poll suggested an urgent need for more UHF spectrum for mobile, but the panelists are, for the most part, thinking about it as a more long-term change, but nevertheless with the need to get the ball rolling now. Spectrum sharing approaches were also discussed, and whether identifying more spectrum for IMT should be the priority in future was left as an open question. Session 6, in which there was 6.1 and 6.2 about building a coordinated strategy towards universal access funding and technology options, which I was privileged to moderate. With half the world connected, unconnected, and most of the other half with poor connections, the session pondered what type of universal access Africa needs and why basic access is not enough and what the cost would be. It was noted that around $9 billion was needed to double broadband connectivity by 2021 and $100 billion to achieve universal access to broadband by 2030. Different forms of financing will be required, including proper use of universal access funds. It was noted that only 54% of the universal access funds collected on the average is dispersed. 408 million lies unused. A toolkit for change was proposed, including policy and regulatory change, development of broad strategic partnerships for technology sharing and funding, development of clear implementation plans, and improvement of monitoring and accountability, improving data collection, and adopting a gender-responsive approach to policy and interventions. A call was made for countries to consider digital infrastructure as critical infrastructure like roads, water, and electricity, and for universal access to be an all-of-government initiative. Zero rating spectrum for universal access until 2030 was suggested. All government infrastructure to carry, infrastructure, meaning roads, railways, power grids, and others, to carry digital infrastructure would reduce the cost and get to universal access faster. Session 7, and I say I'm running out of time. What are your hopes, plans, and expectations for 5G? They underlined that an enabling policy and regulatory environment would be a prerequisite for success to 5G in Africa. Panelists also emphasized the need for harmonization of spectrum. Excuse me. It won't stop. Okay. I apologize. Panelists also emphasized the need for harmonization of spectrum and related policies across various sub-regional economic communities and indeed across the entire continent, so all Africans could benefit from the economies of scale, seamless roaming, and the like. Lastly, Session 8, continuing the path towards a harmonized continental 5G strategy. This panel reiterated that rich content with perspectives on approaches towards a harmonized 5G strategy for Africa was needed. Clear need for continental harmonization on approaches to 5G implementation, poll results and comments with the involvement of all stakeholders. The work has already started and is continuing with proceedings at all levels. And the conclusion was to be continued. Mr. Chairman, this is the summary. As I said, I didn't put everything, but that is the summary of what happened. Let me wish you all good return home to the other room.
Andrew, fantastic. Thank you so much for that summary. And I think you've done an amazing job there to summarize 4 days of discussion into about 10 minutes or so. So I think you managed to get all of the main points, and yeah, really appreciate that. And yeah, thank you again to you and to all of your team at ITU in the region for your support of the event. We really appreciate it. So thank you very much. So next, I would like to welcome back to the stage Mr. Dick Swiwa, who is the chairperson of ICTA in Mauritius. So welcome back, Mr. Swiwa. As I mentioned earlier, we were greatly looking forward to hosting this year's conference in Mauritius, but unfortunately, given the global situation at the moment, of course, it wasn't possible. But it's an absolute honor to still be able to work with ICTA and with your team, and of course with yourself for the conference as a virtual partner this year. And we really do look forward to exploring with you again, hopefully the possibility of bringing the event to Mauritius. But for now, I would like to pass over to you for your closing comments. So, Mr. Chairperson,
thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, my dear colleagues, we have been delighted to associate ourselves this year to this acclaimed and key event for spectrum managers, operators, and manufacturers alike. The Spectrum Management Conference, organized annually in different regions of the world by Forum Global, always attracts the finest experts in the field. The 5th Sub-Saharan Spectrum Management Conference, though held virtually due to the COVID-19 pandemic, has been a huge success, I must say. Discussions held during the conference have been passionate and topics that are of utmost relevance to the African continent. As an island ourselves, Mauritius is particularly aware of the difficult choices to be made with regard to the future of a C-band. This band is of prime importance for aviation safety and inter-island connectivity. At the same time, however, the benefits of using same for 5G should not be undermined. The authority ourselves is sparing no efforts to ensure that adequate spectrum is made available for the timely rollout of 5G networks in Mauritius. Further, the authority, in collaboration with mobile operators and the broadcasting signal distributor, have been working hard for the past month to carry out tests in the 800 MHz band, so as to ensure that televiewers are not severely impacted by the operation of mobile services in this band. Mauritius has gone through the rollout of a successive generations of mobile networks since the introduction of e-tax in the late 80s, thanks to the dynamism of the industry and to an effective spectrum licensing framework. The country has been able to reap the benefits of 2J, 3J, and now 4J. The mobile penetration in 2019, for instance, was around 148%. We now look forward to the introduction of 5G, which we understand will transform the ICT landscape with a wide range of innovative services. And these services will not only be centered around the human customer, as was the case with previous generations. Indeed, 5G is especially about massive machine-type communications, which is expected to give a new dimension to the Internet of Things, as well as ultra-reliable and low-latency communications which would enable such applications as remote surgical operations through the mobile network. A number of developments are also taking place in the satellite sector, for instance, in Mauritius. MEA-SAT-1, the first Mauritian nanosatellite, has reached its final stage of development prior to launch. This project has enabled capacity building at the level of authority with respect to the notification and recording of the radio frequencies to be used by the nanosatellite, in line with the provisions of the ITU radio regulations. Resolution 559 of World Radio Communication Conference 2019 acknowledged that the current orbital slot assignments for the majority of the developing countries have been degraded over several decades of use by the developed nations. Mauritius, through the authority, has therefore taken the necessary steps, together with other members of the SADC, to submit new assignments in view of replacing its degraded orbital position. This is expected to pave the way towards greater presence of our nation in space. 1 year is almost already gone since WRC 19, and WRC 23 is not so far away. At the level of authority, our authority, the high priority agenda items of the forthcoming conference have already been identified, and progress to defining our positions is underway. Agenda item 1.3 regarding additional allocation of a C-band to the mobile service, and agenda item 1.5 regarding additional allocation of a broadcasting band to the mobile service are being followed and monitored closely. I cannot end this topic without, of course, mentioning the high relevance for Mauritius, which has experienced and is experiencing its worst environmental disaster caused by the oil spill resulting from the wreck of the MV Wakasho, of agenda item 1.11 regarding the implementation of e-navigation for increased maritime safety. Ladies and gentlemen, this conference was planned to take place in Mauritius this year. Sadly, the pandemic has acted as a spoiler, and we have not been able to do what we wanted to do at the beginning. However, we hope that the next Sub-Saharan Spectrum Management Conference will take place here, and that after storming discussions on the spectrum management topics, you will be able to enjoy the calmness of our beaches and the nicety of our people. With those words, and until we welcome you in person to Mauritius, let us say we are rescheduling it for next year, a postponement. We'll invite you to have a glimpse of our traditional Sega dance with a short video. And I would like to express my warmest thanks to all the participants, and especially a bravo to the organizers, Forum Global, for the Sub-Saharan Spectrum Management Conference, which is closing today. And I wish you all good health, be safe, stay away from COVID-19, and then let us look forward for next year. Thank you very much indeed.
Les commence bouser, la fumée monter, ça couille de la mer, y'a fait olé, les virés tourner, les rouler sur les reins des côtés, à la licostée. La livine, la fait la mer, les criers, mon amour, ça couille, ça fait la mer, les La divinità per la me, li crier mon ame, sa touye, sa de la me, li lever, li baisser, li tiki-tiki, li rentrer, li valser, li arriver, li balancer. Li fa quitter, li envoyer, dans ses gars, li laver, li tilipier, te roser, assis laver, dans les reins, li pique-pique, sur ses gars, li pionter, tout danser, li révolter. La divinità per la me, li crier, mon ame, sa couiller, sa de la me, li lever, li baisser, li tiki-tiki, li rentrer, li valser, li arriver, li balancer.
So I think that's just a little glimpse of what hopefully we can all expect to experience if we get the opportunity to bring the event to Mauritius next year. Now, I think we would, of course, have loved that video to have been filmed in front of some of these beautiful beaches you have in Mauritius, Mr. Chairman. But given that it's very difficult to get a video of a dance troupe filmed at the moment. I think we found out with the global pandemic at the moment, to get people together in that way was difficult. So that was just a small glimpse, and we very much hope to be able to experience that in person next year. So thank you so much for your words, and thank you for introducing that Sega dancing there. So it's a fantastic way to close the conference. I say close the conference, we're not quite closing, because as I mentioned before, we wanted to leave the final word to you guys out there. So we now have a Have Your Say session. So we wanted to ask you to provide you with the opportunity to have your final say on the conclusions, any outcomes, any thoughts you have for the discussions at the conference. So we're going to be moving now over to the Have Your Say area. So you can find that by navigating using the left-hand menu. Move over to the Have Your Say area. I'll be in there shortly. I hope that our speakers will be able to join us as well. But we'll all be into the Have Your Say, and it'll be your chance to bring your audio, bring your video live, and to give your final thoughts and final conclusions on the conference. So see you over there very shortly. And in the meantime, I would like to once again say a massive thank you to Jean-Pierre, to Andrew, and to Dick for your words and for all of your organization's support of the conference. So it really is appreciated. So thank you very much. And we'll move over now to the Have Your Say area for the final comments from all of you out there. So thank you, everyone.